Aho, Iaho, Aho, Iaho.
We have to note that in Cuba, enslavement did not end until 1876. 1876. Enslavement did not end in Brazil until the 1880s. So some of us who think that enslavement is so far away from us, is so muy lejos de aquí, is so far that we should forget it. No, how can we forget when the fact is that many of our enslaved ancestors suffered in the system right up until the 1880s, 1870s. Enslavement did not end in the Dutch Caribbean before the 1850s, and in the French Caribbean before 1848. It ended in the British Caribbean in 1838. And we know that in some places, like for example, Venezuela under Simon Bolivar and other areas of the Hispanic Caribbean, that in some cases, some freedom came with independence. We know that, but not in every case. So that's where we are. So now we come to the question now, therefore, having looked at enslavement, the legal and philosophical framework, having looked at the conditions under which enslaved people were held, we are moving from that now and we are going to the core question of emancipation in the British Caribbean. As we've indicated, emancipation came in 1838. But long before emancipation came, there were religious groups, churches, which came misioneros, who came to the Caribbean, the Baptists and others, who attempted to improve the conditions of the enslaved. But most of these churches did not challenge the system too much, because they were aware that if they challenged the system, that they could be prevented from working at all. So many of them compromised a bit, but that began to happen. Then in Britain, there were some people who we call the anti-slavery lobby, who began to challenge the slave system and system of enslavement. And by 1807, they succeeded in having the slave trade abolished. But abolishing the slave trade was not the abolition of slavery. So 1807, the slave trade is abolished. But then the pressure from the anti-slavery group in Britain forced the government in Britain to begin to look more closely at the condition of the enslaved. And so in 1823, you had a new what we call a new venture, which we call amelioration. Amelioration. I don't know again my memory of the Spanish equivalent, but I think it must be a word that's very similar. Yes. And what amelioration said was that enslaved people should be allowed to marry. They would be allowed to have Sunday off, so they wouldn't have to work on Sundays. It said that their conditions should generally be improved. It also said that they should not be families should not be separated. But that it is one thing to say that, but the fact is that most planters did not agree with amelioration. And so when it became clear that amelioration was not working, the British government was forced to consider emancipation. But even when it considered emancipation, I have here a note from the Secretary of State for the Colonies. That is the official, the man in charge of the colonial office in Great Britain, who looked after the Caribbean issues. His name was Sir George Murray. And he wrote some things as part of a briefing of the British government on the question of emancipation, because they expected emancipation to come at some point. But this is what he says. He says there are two objects for the attainment of which it is necessary that effectual provision should be made. The first of them is a gradual elevation of the moral character of the slave population. That's the first. And that was the first concern that is being expressed is for some moral improvement in the status of the enslaved. Now, of course, they had enslaved our ancestors. They were responsible for the condition that our ancestors lived in. And now they're coming with this pseudo religious concern, moral concern. But then he says the second issue is the due protection of all the just rights in property, which existing laws have vested in the owners of the slaves. And that is what he's saying. Two issues that have to be considered when we come to emancipation. One, we have to ensure that the enslaved people become Christian, become moral. But the second and most important thing is that we have to pay attention to the property rights, the rights that the enslavers have in their human property. So that emancipation, when it comes, or when it does come, is going to focus on controlling the formerly enslaved, and secondly, ensuring that the property rights of the enslavers are borne in mind, are kept in mind. So emancipation does come. And so what do you find? In the British case, there was a period of adjustment called apprenticeship. And the apprenticeship was designed to ensure that the planters got a few more years of labor. The law says that the enslaved people were free from 1834. It was passed in 1833, but it came to effect in 1834. And it said the enslaved people were free. But although it said they were free, it also said they were required to work for the former enslavers for 2/3 of the week. And that went on for another 4 years. It was supposed to have gone on for another 6 years, 8 years, but it ended 4 years later. But that's not all. Because the major concern was the property rights of the enslavers, the British government also passed a law within the Act of Abolition, which gave the enslavers throughout the British colonies, not only in the Caribbean, but elsewhere in the world, 20 million pounds. 20 million pounds as compensation. Notice that Black enslaved people were not given any compensation. And I suspect that if you were to go into Costa Rica, you go to Colombia, you go to Venezuela, you go to Argentina, you go to Santo Domingo, wherever you go in the Caribbean, you will find that no attention is paid to compensation for the enslaved, for the horror of slavery that they had endured. So here the law, the Act of Abolition, gives the planters a few more years of labor, and it also gives them compensation, monetary compensation. But that is not all. In the Act of Abolition itself, it said that during the 4 or 5, in fact, it was supposed to say 6 or 8 years, when the enslaved people were to be apprentices, if they wished to, they could buy their freedom. But notice the paradox here. If they were free, as the Act said, why on earth should they have to buy their freedom? It meant, of course, that they really were not free. So this is what happened. So here we have a situation where emancipation comes, but the social status of the formerly enslaved is at the bottom of the social ladder. They were at the bottom of the social ladder during enslavement, and they were at the bottom of the social ladder after emancipation. They could not vote in the elections. They could not become members of La Asamblea, of the Assembly, the House of Assembly. They could not, they were prohibited from even in the church. There were special pews, special seats. They could not sit in some seats. So from emancipation in 1938 until 1937, 38, 100 years, for 100 years after emancipation, our people, our ancestors, continued to suffer from deprivation. They continue to suffer under the law. The law sought to prevent them from owning their own land. When they tried to own their own land, the colonial officials pushed the price up to create a problem for them. If they wanted to be vendors in the local market, they had to get a license to buy goods. And in the case of Barbados, they passed a law called the Masters and Servants Act, which said that as long as you remain on an estate, a plantation, you were legally bound to work there. Even if you wanted to leave and go elsewhere, you could be fined or imprisoned or both for trying to leave a plantation. And they could do that because the plantations own about 92% of the land. So a peasantry did not develop in the same way as, let's say, other parts of the Anglophone Caribbean and the Hispanic Caribbean. We didn't have a strong peasantry in Barbados. So up to 1938, most of most of the descendants of the formerly enslaved worked on plantations. They were paid the lowest wages in the Caribbean. Many of them, their housing conditions were inferior. Health provision was almost non-existent. So up to 1938, 1937, our people still suffered. Well, 1930s come and there are riots, disturbances, huelgas, strikes, all kinds of things happen in the Caribbean, from Barbados to Jamaica, all over the Caribbean. People began to rebel against their conditions. And finally, by 1943, for the first time in Barbados, everybody now gets the right to vote. It took 100 plus years before our people got the right to vote. And it took another 20 years or so for many of our people to find alternatives to the plantation system. Some of them migrated. That's the only way some of them could escape the system. Some migrated. I'm sure that a few of our people migrated to Costa Rica. I know that some of them migrated to Cuba. I know many migrated to Suriname. I know some migrated to Brazil. They went to work at the United Fruit Company. They went to work in the sugar industry, all kinds of places. 1966, Barbados becomes independent, but that is after Jamaica. Jamaica becomes independent first, and Trinidad, and British Guyana. No, this year became Guyana or Guyana. So here you have independence. But when independence comes, our majority of our people are still living in rather depressed social conditions. There's a group in the University of West Indies which became known as the New World theorists. There's a man called Lloyd Bess, and another man called Norman Girvan. A lot of these persons wrote extensively about the plantation system. And there one person who won the Nobel Prize for economics. These men wrote to demonstrate that the plantation system had left our people underdeveloped. So independence came, but our people were still deprived of the opportunity for development. Even in terms of the economic situation, most of our third world countries in this region, including the Hispanic Caribbean, were exporters of primary products. And the price for our products was not fixed in the Caribbean. The price was fixed in Europe. All that is a legacy of the slave system. So here we are, coming right up now to the 1970s and 80s. And another issue that faces us is that many of our people have been brainwashed into believing that our African past is an inferior past. There's a Cuban poet, and I've spoken with him so often in my lectures, called Nicolas Guillen. Has a poem, a long poem called Songoro Kosongo. And he talks about the women of Havana. That as the women of Havana, and he's talking about the Creole women, the women who obviously had una mezcla de la sangre de África y de Europea también. But they refuse to acknowledge the African past. So as Nicolas Guillen says in Spanish, they're walking the streets, and as they're walking the streets, they're saying, these are the women, he said, no somos negras, somos blancas. We are not black, we are white. And Nicolas Guillen says that as he observes them walking, he observes la trasera. He observes the backside. And he says, mentira, 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 mentira. In other words, he's saying, you lie, you lie, you lie, you lie. You're saying you're not black, but I see your backside, and your backside tells me that you're African. I can see your African pride. So don't tell me that. So that's what happened to our people. And Bob Marley, in his song, said that we must emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. So that one of the legacies of enslavement is that many of our people still do not see themselves as African. They think that Africa is backward. They have no idea about our past. So that brings us then to the question of reparations.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber.